Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the McCune Charitable Foundation. Funding for the Your New Mexico Government Project comes from the Thornburg Foundation and New Mexico Local News Fund. And the Nieper Natural History Programming Fund for KNME-TV. And viewers like you.
This week on New Mexico in Focus, it will soon be time for the state to redraw its political boundaries. Can we do better?
What happens when we don't have the freest, fairest, most inclusive, most competitive of elections?
Plus, Our Land looks at what Native voices can bring to critical conversations about water in the West. New Mexico in Focus starts now. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm your host, Gene Grant. That conversation about redistricting is part of our ongoing Your New Mexico Government Project, a partnership with KUNM Radio and the Santa Fe Reporter. It's a fascinating look at what's at stake locally from the census and the people who are trying to ensure good government follows closely behind the count. With Labor Day behind us, the Line Opinion Panel gets political this week as we talk voting, debates, and polls, which is where we begin. The Albuquerque Journal has once again enlisted Brian Sanderoff's research and polling company to survey important campaigns and issues ahead of the election. We don't see as much polling as we used to, and while we don't want to rely too much on them as a predictive tool, they give us a good idea of what's happening at a given moment and how strategies have been working throughout campaigns. Joining me in the studio through the magic of the internet is a welcome guest we're always glad to have, Catherine McGilt. She's the founder, director of the New Mexico Black Leadership Council. Also joining me on screen is former House Rep and Line regular Dan Foley. And to complete our panel, we've got State Senator and Line regular Dee Dee Feldman. All right, the president trails Joe Biden by 15 points, 50 to 39%. And maybe the big takeaway, as Mr. Sanderoff and reporter Dan Boyd peeled that onion, is that while the president's base is strong, moderates break hugely for Mr. Biden, about 2-1. And Dan, I got to ask you, does the president's strategy here need to change if he wants to win New Mexico? And if he does have to change, how?
I think it's hard to answer that question just because the polls have shown that they don't make any sense, right? I mean, you look at the gap between Biden and Trump in New Mexico, and then you look at how close the race is between Lujan and Ronchetti. It's just an interesting. I mean, and the reason I bring that up is Ronchetti's made no bones about tying himself to the Trump train, and Lujan's made no bones about tying himself to the progressive agenda. And yet here you have two local folks that are in a much closer battle than the race seems to be for the president. Look, I think that at the end of the day, we know the way the state breaks down. Obviously, Albuquerque, Santa Fe is a very progressive, liberal-leaning part of the state. There's not enough votes outside of Albuquerque.
But let me ask you a question. Trump's at 39, Ronchetti's at 40%. They're not that different. Is this a?
They're not that different, but look at where Biden is and where Lujan is. I mean, there's not that many points separating them, and I think that you're going to find out.
It's a 5-point spread there.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, the margin of error is usually 3. So to find that we're even within, the striking distance of the margin of error in a state that Democrats hugely outweigh Republicans in voter registration, I think it's a good shot for Republicans. Now the problem is what can Republicans do to capitalize on it, right? You have the legislature. New Mexico is a unique state, right? In big states, California, New York, you really look for your coattails from the top down, right?
Right.
You look for your governor, U.S. senator, candidate, president. In New Mexico, that outside of when the governor runs, it really seems to be a bottom-up approach, right? I mean, you either have to have really strong legislative races that are going to get people out to vote, which they filter up the ballot, than you do going down the ballot. And so, we know the House and the Senate are both making a push on both sides to capture the House and the Senate. The Republicans think they have a chance to pick up 2 or 3 seats in the legislature down south. You have a hotly contested CD2 seat. So my answer on the Biden Trump deal, I don't think Trump is as bad off as people think when you start in his stance on oil and gas. I don't think there's anything President Trump can do to win over independents and liberals of Albuquerque, Santa Fe area.
There you go. Dee Dee, let me ask you this. The Hispanic vote, Gary Johnson did quite well, as we all remember, in 2016. Interesting, Mr. Biden is doing well with Hispanics, certainly. But is there something we need to be aware of with the Hispanic vote when it comes to Joe Biden?
Well, Joe Biden is leading Trump in this category by 2-1.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty heavy odds there. I think, on these polls, particularly the one of Biden and Trump versus the congressional polls, you really have to look at the nature of the poll itself. The size of the sample for the presidential poll was larger than it was for the congressional polls. That makes a difference. One of the things that really, two things actually that really are different this time in the poll is the small number of undecideds. Mm-hmm. Things are pretty fixed in place already. I believe there's a 7% undecided in that presidential race.
Right.
That's much smaller than the usual, which is usually about 13 to 15. And in other races, it is equally true. The other thing that I found different about this poll was that instead of the Republican, Independent, and Democratic categories, which Sandroff usually uses, this time it's moderate, liberal, and conservative. This is new. Yes. This is new. And I was interested in the fact that he did that this time, which may sort of indicate a shift in the party loyalties. There's some things about it that are very fixed. Like, we saw that more Hispanics favor the Democrats, more people in the northwest part of the state favor the Republicans. The east side is solidly Republican, and the Rio Grande corridor is Democrat.
Right.
But this whole thing about moderates, liberals, and conservatives may be a shift in how we're looking at the voting populace. And keep in mind that these are likely voters that were polled. In other words, they voted in either the 2016 or the 2018 elections, or both. This does not poll frequent voters who vote in primaries, and it does not poll newly registered or new voters.
That bit right there, that's interesting to me, the new voters not being polled. And you got to wonder, Kathy McGill, sorry, Dee Dee, to kind of cut you there. I'm just running a little short on time. Kathy, talk about that, the influence of young voters, new voters, all that, and what it means for these numbers. Are they going to change anything here? What's your guess?
I think that there are a lot of new voter initiatives. And I just saw something recently that a Rio Rancho team from a high school is soliciting students from all across the state who are going to be 18 at the time of the election, or talking to voters who may not be 18 at the time of this election, but looking towards future elections when they will be 18. So I think young people are getting motivated to get out there and vote, and that's really encouraging to me. And I think that they can make a big shift in what happens. From my vantage and what I'm hearing from young people is that, they are not happy with this binary system. They don't like the candidates, but I do like hearing that they are still going to participate in the process. And that's what we're encouraging young first-time voters to do, is to get out there and learn about the process, and especially learn about what's happening in your local governments. What's happening with those initiatives that are going to affect you immediately, and you're going to see the people every day that you're voting for, that you're going to see them more often. So I do think that young voters are going to have a significant role to play, and that we need to be focusing on getting them out to vote. Voter registration day, September 22nd, is something that these young people are saying, we're going to get our first-time voters out there to get involved in this electoral process. So I'm excited about it.
Kathy, real quick, I'll stay with you on this. We just got a couple of minutes left in this segment. What do you make of the CD2 race being too close to call, in quotes? Xochitl Torres is doing a lot of TV. Yvette Herrell is doing her thing. It's too close. Are you surprised by that?
I am not surprised by it. I think, one of the things that we don't talk about is that there is a big race issue here, is that, who are, Republicans likely to vote for. It looks like it's sort of split along racial lines, that Hispanics are more likely to vote for Torres Small and white voters are more likely to vote for Yvette Herrell. So I think that, it has been pretty predictable that it was going to be really close.
Dee Dee, would you agree with that? Predictable? I mean,
Yes.
Xochitl Torres won by 2 points last time around.
Yes, I think it's very predictable. This has been a Republican seat. Sochi won only by 2 points, as you say.
A little bit less, actually, now that I think about it.
Yeah. One of the things that I find very funny about that race is I've been following the ads for both of these women. And it's interesting that, all the congressional candidates are women,
Right.
Which is a first. But some of the themes that are being used in that race are also being used by Ron Ketty in his race. He will work with anyone. So will Yvette Torres. So will Sochi Small. And then they're being criticized. She's being criticized for that. But he's using the same theme. And I think it's appealing to the middle.
Dan, real quick, let me ask you, you touched on Ron Ketty there a little bit and you're open, but more specifically, what does he have to do to close the gap here? I mean, is it the debate issue? I mean, Ben Ray's agreed to 2 debates only. How does he get around this being a challenger?
Yeah, he's got to. I mean, first thing he's got to do, what every challenger has to do, is raise a ton of money. I mean, that's step number one. I mean, there's no lack of money. Ben Ray has proven that he can raise money. Being, he was charged of raising money under Nancy Pelosi in the House and did a phenomenal job when they took back the House. What he's got to do is if you don't have the money, he's got to figure out a way to get earned media. And he's got to figure out a way to get Ben Ray to, produce Ben Ray as something other than, a legacy politician. He's got to find a way to chink the armor that Ben Ray is, and you saw that, right? There was an ad that came out early about, prior to going to Congress that Congressman Lujan was a blackjack dealer. He's really got to draw a distinction. I think it's going to be interesting. It's going to be a neat roll of the dice to see if Ben Ray is correct in avoiding the debates more than the 2 debates with Mark Ronchetti. The question is, what can Mark Ronchetti do about it? Everything in politics is irrelevant unless you have the money to get out and tell the people why it's relevant. And unless Ronchetti can get that money poured in here to help him, hammer Ben Ray, it may wind up making the race a little closer. But if people don't start ponying up the cash and letting him get a consistent drumbeat message out there, it's hopeless.
Good call there. Right at time on that one. Our Land is next. We're back after that to debate debates.
To really help create communities of interest so that you're not splitting up underserved communities who have historically been damaged in these fights, in these gerrymandered districts, because their power is diluted. And when that happens, you lose a voice in the community that's really, really important.
In the western U.S., states carved up river water between themselves using compacts long before tribes had a say in how rivers like the Colorado or the Rio Grande will be managed. Even though tribes hold the oldest and most senior water rights on those rivers, they still don't always have a seat at the table today. That's starting to change with efforts like the 10 Tribes Partnership on the Colorado River. In this episode of Our Land, correspondent Laura Paskus checks in on what it means for tribes to truly have a say in Western water issues.
So Daryl V. Hill, thanks for joining me. The work that you do as part of the 10 Tribes Partnership and also the Water and Tribes Initiative is focused on making sure that tribes are part of developing the next guidelines for the Colorado River. Were tribes not a part of those original negotiations in the past?
Yeah, good morning, Laura. Yeah, no, they weren't. And that's why it becomes even more important, that we start to create the foundation of, why it's important for tribes to be able to participate or to make the choice to be able to participate, be able to build a capacity to be able to do that. And there's a lot of different reasons on why, it's important. The 10 Tribes Partnership of the Colorado River alone has close to 2.9 million acre feet of water rights in the Colorado River Basin. And those 10 tribes are on the main stem or its tributaries. And the reason that's important is because that's about 20 to 25% of the volume of the Colorado River. And starting in 2007, when the operating guidelines were developed for the Colorado River, there wasn't tribal engagement, there wasn't tribal involvement in that process at all. And so, move forward, with the 2009 basin study of the Colorado River Basin Supply Demand Study. It was a partnership. It was created out of a partnership with the 7 basin states and the federal government through Bureau of Reclamation. And again, knowing all those facts in terms of the amount of volumes of tribal water and the fact that, some of it a lot of it had been undeveloped in that particular study, and that started in 2009, tribes were not invited to participate in that particular conversation either. And so, but out of that, it really was an awakening for tribes in the partnership.
There's so many challenges in the Colorado River Basin right now. Climate change alone is a huge problem. I'm wondering what opportunities tribes bring to the conversation.
Well, again, it goes back to that, thousands of years of sustainable living. From what I was taught, from my grandparents and Hamas and Zia in particular, is how we fit into our reliance and our gratitude, for life, and how we fit into it, and our reverence for all living creatures. And so I think when we're moving forward with this whole conversation, those thousands of years of sustainable living and what we learn from it really ignites the broader conversation of who we are as human beings. And collectively, how we want to live together, and how we want to be together, and how we see ourselves fitting into the world, and I think those are great conversations to be had right now.
The way that the Colorado River Basin is managed is there's the compact, and then there's essentially these amendments and changes and guidelines. Is the compact itself set in stone?
I don't think so. It's a law. And, when I got involved with this process 10 years ago, it was funny because I was like, so we have all these problems in the basin, and why don't we just change the law of the river? And, I could have been, strung up for probably saying that, and I still say that today.
Well, thank you so much, Daryl V. Hill, for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
Representative Lente, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I spoke with Daryl V. Hill about the Colorado River and the need to include the basin's 29 tribes when developing the guidelines for the river, for the next guidelines for the river. And I'm curious, when it comes to the Rio Grande Compact, how are Pueblo water rights incorporated, and what input did the Pueblos have during the early part of the 20th century when that compact was being negotiated?
Back in the early 20th century, you got to mind yourself is that many of the Pueblos in the Middle Rio Grande Valley, or just in the Rio Grande Valley completely, they didn't have much of a political clout or much of a clout at all in regards to being able to assert any type of rights in regards to a water right. And so many of them, in my mind and from what I've understood, is that many of them did not understand the notion of being able to own or take claim to own something like water. And so for them to say, we're going to claim X amount of acre feet or X amount of water for our purposes now and into the future, I think for them was really foreign, especially considering the language barriers related to my Pueblo, for instance, from Tiwa to English, whether it's spoken or written. And so back then, taking into consideration that much, I mean, we're only talking about a century ago, but at the same time, I think about 10 years ago and how much things have changed. And so when you think about that, I would imagine that their claim in terms of their participation to the compact might have been rather limited.
So you yourself, you're an irrigator, a water rights expert, a legislator, and I'm curious what you think if tribes were brought in early and if they were treated like the sovereign nations that they are, how facing some of these really big challenges that we face in New Mexico, how things could look different in a decade or a century?
Well, I mean, history has proven itself that the Pueblos have been in the Middle Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico for centuries, and they have been able to play a part in the resilience of how they have lived their lives as agriculturalists, as folks that have taken care of the land has taken care of them. And so if they can lend themselves into what, for instance, if they can lend themselves to allowing someone like me, not to say I want to be a part of that right now, but if they allowed someone like me or my counterparts in any one of the villages to be a part of that discussion, and that part of that discussion can then be someone like a Pueblo person from a Cochiti Pueblo, Santo Domingo Pueblo, wherever, saying, well, my grandfather or my grandmother or my forefathers talked about this being the way things had been done in the past. And if we can lend ourselves to learn from those past practices, I think that could be a great start. That could be a great collaboration message between the two parties, for instance, or the many parties. But as we move forward, I mean, it seems to me that to be able to be a part of the process, because not only do we have that historical identity in place here in the Middle Rio Grande Valley, but also now with that prior and paramount water rights, with those senior water rights that are associated with the tribes, we cannot have people negotiating and using those senior water rights as bargaining chips that they don't even own, that the tribes have and have to protect.
Well, Representative Valente, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I think it's very important what Facebook does. I'm disappointed with the half-hearted measure that they took to include only new ads and only a week before the election. That said, I think it's very important that Facebook is continuing that ban after the election and has said that they will not spread rumors of one candidate declaring him or herself the winner.
A staple of the campaign season, debates are critical to this election. While presidential candidates are debating more than ever in the primaries and have 3 debates set yet again this fall, debates are a rarity in high-profile local races. Now, here at NMPBS, we've locked down one of the 2 Senate debates. Watch it October 18th at 6 p.m. But with few rallies and even fewer chances to meet the candidates if we're being safe and socially distant, voters are left to do it on their own comparisons. We're hoping to get a congressional debate or a candidate conversation on the calendar here at the station, but the question we always ask is, are they helpful or just a parade of talking points? Tired talking points at that. Now, Catherine, let me start with you on that question. What's the best way to go with these debates? How should we consider them?
I think that they are really important. Mm-hmm. We get an opportunity to see how people respond under pressure. We get to see them up close. And I hope that if we have really good moderators who are asking really good questions, and questions that voters are interested in hearing the answers to, that the debates will give us an opportunity to learn more about the individual candidates. I don't think that in this particular race, because people have pretty much decided already who they're going to vote for, that they are really going to sway voters. But I think that we should know who our candidates are and who we are electing, and get more of an up close, in-depth opportunity to learn more. Maybe what we need to do is look at how we do the debates and what kind of questions we're asking for those debates. So, if we give them softball questions so they can just do their talking points, then
let me bust in here. Have you ever changed your mind about somebody by watching a debate? Has that ever flipped you on a candidate?
Never.
Okay. Yeah. Let me go to Dee Dee on this same question. What are we doing with these debates essentially? I mean, you've been down this road a few times in your career as well. What are we supposed to take from these debates?
Well, the debates are the only time that a candidate has guaranteed audience without paying for it. Mm-hmm. So, so ordinary people can look at them unfiltered by their advertising messages. However, the way campaigns are now is candidates are taught that their campaign message has to be consistent with their debate message. And so that's where you get, the canned kind of responses. I tuned into the Yvette Herrell, Claire Chase debate during the primary, and I was expecting a real fight, some real good entertainment, and I walked away rather bored. So I agree. The debates have to be done in a lively fashion. I'm a fan of candidates asking one another questions, and having as much dialogue as possible. Utilizing a town hall format. We can't do that now. So we're kind of stuck with the traditional debate format, which I think is unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Dan, interestingly, KOB4 is having their debate on October 5th, and Ben Ray has refused at this point to participate. And so what they're going to do is they're going to have, of course, Bob Walsh, who's the Libertarian candidate, and Mark Ronchetti, and just leave an empty seat for Ben Ray Lujan. What's your sense of the debate season as it's going along here? Is this serving the public? Are we better off as voters by having a candidate not show up for debates? How should we take that?
I don't think you're ever served by the candidate not showing up to the debate. I mean, I think if the forums are put on, I mean, you ought to be there. The problem with the forums is that, these forums spend way too much time asking about what's your favorite book, and if you could meet your most famous person, what would you say to them today? And they ask these kinds of questions instead of getting right to the heart of the matter and saying, look, Mark Ronchetti, you said this, why have you changed? Or Ben Ray Lujan, you voted for this, why have you changed?
Right.
And I think that's why I'm with Dee Dee. I think it's more. The Lincoln Douglas debates were famous for a reason, right? I mean, these guys traveled around the country, set up on courthouse steps, and had discussions for hours upon hours upon hours among themselves. And I think if we had these forums that were more geared towards, look, I don't care if Mark Ronchetti wants to scream and holler at Ben Ray Lujan, that's just going to show you who he is. Or Ben Ray Lujan, whatever the deal is. I think these, if you watch from the presidential debates down, right? Obviously, the higher up you go, the more seasoned they get. I mean, how many times have we watched the presidential debates, whether it's in the primaries, and they say, tell us your position on tax reform? And the answer is, thanks for the question. I want to tell you what Dee Dee Feldman did to become education. And you're like, no one answers the questions. And so I think it's far better to just say, we're going to have a debate. Here's how it's going to go. You're going to have 9 minutes between you guys, and we're going to have a commercial break. And you're, kind of like the WWE. We're going to start with Mark Ronchetti. Mark, you go, and you guys duke it out for the next 9 minutes. We're going to ring a bell and go to commercial and let you go back. I think you'll find more out about their personalities and what they stand for and what the issues are than you will having these moderators that come up with these highly intellectual questions that they never answer anyway. And they just pivot and try to get their talking points out.
I have to agree with you. If it's supposed to be a stress test, as Kathy McGill sort of was alluding to, it doesn't really come across in most debates because of that dynamic you're mentioning. Dee Dee, I got a question for you. This is maybe something for us a little bit older. I've always felt like we've put so much into that old Kennedy-Nixon debate, that first TV debate, that everyone likes to lean on and say, look, oh my gosh, Nixon got crushed and Kennedy did all this and that. Are we putting too much into the visual, into the TV side of debating versus the meat of what people are actually saying?
Well, I think we're always putting too much into the visual entertainment aspect of it, rather than to the substance. But I do think that people judge character,
right?
Sometimes by appearance, sometimes by actions. And debates did make more of a difference in the past, though, than they are now. I do think that sometimes at the margins, they can be influential. For example, Obama, when he first debated in, I think it was 2012, did a terrible job and lost some support. But then that spurred him to improve in the next two debates. But when there's only one debate that everybody focuses on, it's much more high stakes.
That's a good point. We have to throw, I'm going to move on here, but we have to throw in as well the amount of people mailing in early voting. Debates are later down the cycle. Does it really matter as much as they used to? We'll find out. This group will be back to take a whack at one final issue, voting in this critical election. We'll be back in just a few minutes. This week, we're looking ahead to what happens when the census count is done. And please make sure everyone you know is counted, by the way. It's not just federal funding at stake. After the count, state lawmakers will redraw district maps for the legislature. They could, as in years past, keep themselves in power for the next decade, or they could make changes that shift power into voters' hands. Now a citizens' task force is taking shape, and its founders hope it will pressure politicians to do the right thing. Here's NMIF correspondent Gwyneth Dolan with a report that's part of your New Mexico government project.
Rob Black and Lily Irvin Vitella, thank you so much for being with us today. Lily, New Mexico First is recruiting folks for a redistricting task force. What is the point of this task force? What is it going to do?
We're bringing together 21 to 25 people from across New Mexico to pull together recommendations and suggested rules for our state legislators in the redistricting process. So there's been efforts before to have community engagement and community conversations, but the connection between what community is saying and the redistricting results aren't always so clear. And so we believe that with greater rules of engagement, a shared sense of accountability from a cross-partisan group, that we'll be better able to understand and reflect the voices of communities in the redistricting process.
I think I caught just a little bit of an understatement there. You just wrote a policy brief that is soon to be published about redistricting. Tell me just the overview of what you found.
So basically what we did is we write policy briefs in a way that are intended to be rigorous yet super accessible to folks. So for folks who haven't had an opportunity to think much about redistricting and how that works, there's a bit of history, connecting it kind of to our history in New Mexico and in the country around efforts to have open, democratic, inclusive elections. So that context setting. And then really what we dive into are things that work in terms of civic engagement and genuine, deeply authentic civic engagement rather than the appearance of. So we don't have a particular strategy in mind that we'd like the task force to adhere to. We really very much have faith and belief and confidence of a lot of really smart people to bring those ideas forward and for good ideas well facilitated to bubble to the top as recommendations. But where we do have a real commitment in terms of outcome is around process. And ultimately, this task force is responsible for giving a roadmap to legislators to consider for citizens to be able to decide who our voters or who our elected people are, rather than our electeds deciding who their voters are. So we want more open, more competitive campaigns.
Rob, you're on the board at New Mexico First. You're helping to organize this process. It has been brutal the pandemic has been brutal for families, for individuals, for businesses, especially. Why do you think members of the business community should pay attention to redistricting now?
Gwyneth, that's a great question. And I think it's something where understanding the consequences of bad redistricting are really important. And those consequences, there's many consequences to it. From the business community perspective, we want good, thoughtful governance. That means when you have competitive districts where people have to debate their ideas, and those ideas are, and the race can go either way because it's really going to be based on those competitive ideas, that creates better governance. It creates better government. When you have the ability for an elected official to pick their own voters, and they create safe districts, so a district where it's overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democrat, the discussion tends to get extreme on either side. And so they don't have to cross over for other party votes. They're really going to go try to just grab their own parties, which causes really extreme positions to resurface in those discussions and those elections, and tend to be more extreme candidates that get elected. We would like to see, again, that the requirement or a situation where those races are competitive, the ideas are competitive, so that the governance is more effective in the end.
So, business people are just one among a large group of people that you think should be involved. Lily, who are you looking for to serve on this task force? Should people have some experience? Should they be experts?
So we're looking actually for a whole range of perspectives. Ultimately, we want our task force to look like New Mexico. We want it to look like New Mexico in terms of race, ethnicity, culture, coming from different language traditions, coming from different political ideologies, coming from different faith traditions, or not a faith tradition, or not a political party, right? We want folks, so we have folks who have tossed their hat in the ring, who are PhDs or JDs, so they have some expertise on these issues in terms of the technicalities, but we also really value and respect the expertise of people in community, and everybody in a democracy has a stake in this. And so while we are impressed and inspired by people's sweat equity that has gone into it, we know that there are a lot of ways to bring value to the conversation. So what you'll see if we are successful in our efforts, and I have every reason to believe that we will be, is very well balanced in terms of political ideology, very well balanced in terms of geography, and very well balanced in terms of demographics, including a range of kinds of education expertise, both from lived experiences and also from that being somebody's research priority.
And so, Rob, you're representing the business industry, one of the hats you wear, but you also have some experience with redistricting and democracy promotion in your past.
I do. I've had the privilege of working overseas, doing democracy development work in South Africa during the transition, and in Cambodia and other countries. But more recently was involved when I was at the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce in efforts at statewide reform in California, and where we were looking at how did we do redistricting in California? How could we improve it in a way that really created more of a community voice, that made the discussions of how we structured those districts more fair and transparent, and move those away from really partisan discussions and into nonpartisan or really nonpartisan discussions, because they were looking at, we looked at using retired judges, civilians who aren't affiliated with elected officials, to really help create communities of interest so that you're not splitting up underserved communities who have historically been damaged in these fights, in these gerrymandered districts, because their power is diluted. And when that happens, you lose a voice in the community that's really, really important.
You know, in New Mexico, the legislature does pretty much this whole thing. They get the census results, and then they essentially go behind a curtain and come out a little while later with a plan. It's a little more complicated than that, but not much. And California ended up deciding to do it in a really different way. What did they decide?
They decided to, again, go to a nonpartisan approach where I believe it's a panel of retired judges and maybe even existing judges. I can't remember. It's been a decade since we went through this reform there, to help set the criteria for how they would first draw the lines and then put forward maps for review and approval. So it was really, again, done in a nonpartisan way. What it was designed to keep communities with a set of criteria to base those decisions on, but it was designed to keep communities of interest aligned, to ensure that those districts were balanced as much as possible as far as the representation, so that you did have good discussions. It wasn't the idea of whose party you were with wasn't part of the criteria to determine where the lines were drawn. And they also didn't restrict it to, well, the current representative lives here, so we need to make sure they get to stay there. Because that's not in the best interest of the district. That's in the best interest of that elected official, but that's not what democracy is about. Elected officials are there to serve the people. So we need to make sure that the people have a fair representation within their district when they're electing their leaders.
And that's an interesting little tidbit you just brought up, because, in New Mexico, as it is now, they are allowed to consider where the existing lawmaker lives as a factor in drawing the district. So, Lily, is this the kind of thing that might come out of the redistricting task force, a recommendation to, for example, change that?
It might. I think one of the things that we're being guided by is the best practices across the country, right? So, but we also always want something to make sense for New Mexico. So the NCSL has done a really good job of laying out, here are some best practices, here are some emerging practices, and explicitly this issue around how to deal with incumbency has come up. And the suggestion nationally, the trend nationally, is away from protecting incumbents for exactly the reasons that Rob suggested. So that question will certainly be raised. Will there be a recommendation or a rule around what to do about incumbents? Will we suggest that it's okay to protect incumbents, or will we suggest that it's more important that we take other factors into consideration and are either neutral to that, or we're actively putting that aside and saying we don't want to protect incumbents? And that has a lot to do with Rob's point, which I think is a sound one, is what's going to lead to the fairest, most open, most competitive elections, so that way people who are running for office have a vested interest in making sure that they're building relationships with all of their constituents rather than just the folks who are most likely to vote for them.
The National Conference of State Legislatures, which is sort of a research body that study these things, you just referenced them, Lily, and they did a report specifically looking at New Mexico. We talked about it last year, comparing New Mexico to other states and how we do the redistricting process. One of the things that it showed was that there are comparatively fewer rules about the way we have to do it here. I thought their report was very clear. I wrote a 25-page report on redistricting myself last year, and I'm just the last one in a long line of people who've done reporting on the pretty dysfunctional, I don't think I'm stretching it to say pretty dysfunctional way that we do this here. What makes you think that this task force is going to accomplish something that no one else has accomplished before?
I'm eternally optimistic, so I'll just take what I say with a grain, but I am somebody who very much believes that democracy works, especially when it's done well. And so the fact that we are bringing together people of a lot of different diverse perspectives and that our eye is on the prize, I think that's critical. I think another piece is we're at a very interesting juncture in time. I think there are issues that the pandemic has kind of ripped the veil back on, and that Black Lives Matter has amplified and brought to the forefront about what happens when we don't have the freest, fairest, most inclusive, most competitive of elections. What happens when the legacy of racism in our voting laws and in our Constitution continues to play out and some people's vote matters more than others? Well, what happens is that we have ways that resources are distributed, that decisions are made that don't serve the public interest, that are more likely to serve the special interest. And so I think at this point in history, more than any time, at least in the last 4 decades, there's a real attention to how government functions, how power is wielded. And so I'm a firm believer that there are people who have been marginalized, who are still willing to give some credence to us having a healthy democracy and a social contract in place. But then it is upon all of us to get it right, to really design systems of decision-making about the distribution of power and resources in ways that really serve community good. And if we fail to do that, not only will it be really expensive, as it was last time around, where we spent over $6 million in lawsuits and then ultimately had a judge draw the map, but we will lose so much in our social capital, in our belief and confidence in one another that we can do this thing we call democracy right. And I think that I'm not the only one who sees just how much is on the line. And we know that even if our legislators choose to take none of the recommendations of this task force, that people are watching in a way that they're no longer deferring and saying, okay, well, we'll let other folks figure that out. Like, people are watching and they care, and they know that redistricting isn't this thing that's so complicated and so over folks' head. It's something that impacts all of us. And I don't think that we can do a process again where we disregard what the community says without there being a price to pay at the polls.
Thank you for that. Rob, we only have a few seconds left here, but I wanted to ask you, you've seen how this played out in other places. The California system is very different from the way it happens here in New Mexico now. Will you consider this process a success if there is incremental, tiny change that comes out of it?
Well, I think any improvement is improvement, but I would say that it is fundamentally unfair given the time we are in, and I think it's always been unfair. But it's, as Lily said, it's elevated for the powerful to get to pick who gets to continue to be powerful. There's an inherent conflict of interest there. And what we need to do is set up an opportunity where the citizenry has that power and gets to help decide how those discussions, how those debates are structured. And I am also optimistic that folks who, with good hearts and good intentions, will realize that it is in their best interest to create that power in the people and not be seen as hoarding that power to themselves.
Rob Black and Lily Irvin Vitella, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
It's no exaggeration to say that November 2020's election it will be one of the most pivotal in our country's history. But getting as many New Mexicans to vote as possible and getting them to feel confident about voting safely and securely may be harder than ever during this pandemic year. The New Mexico Department of Health has set voting restrictions for in-person voting, while officials are still encouraging citizens to vote by mail through absentee balloting, even if it's not founded in fact. Loss of faith in the U.S. Postal Service threatens to overshadow that message. Indeed, polling locations will be allowed to have 25% of maximum occupancy or 4 voters inside at any one time, whichever is greater. Mobile units will be limited to 2. And voters inside and waiting outside polling locations must maintain 6 feet of distance, of course, with such restrictions. I got to ask, do you think voters who wait until Election Day on November 3rd risk being left out?
Being left out of what? They will get to vote. They will definitely. They must be allowed to vote if they are in line, and we are hoping that there will be increased absentee voting and increased early voting, so the crowds on all counts will be reduced. And one thing that the county clerks could do to ease the situation is to use drop boxes. And I noticed in Bernalillo County and in Doña Ana County, they are beginning to use drop boxes for absentee ballots that can be dropped off there. I think that will increase at least the perception of safety for voters to come and to avoid the post office as well, if there are any doubts about that. So, yeah, I mean, I think that we're expecting a big turnout, and it will, as in the primary, and it will work.
Dan, what's your sense of the mail-in voting thing? Is this much to do about nothing? We know where the president's at on this and such. The public has another thought. I mean, you look at what's going on here. We're going to be voting in record numbers by mail this cycle.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you mean by mail-in voting, right? If you're talking about absentee voting, I don't think anybody's worried about that. I think we start talking about ballot harvesting and openly just mailing out ballots to people based on where we think they should be going. I think there's a real problem with that. So I think we have to separate the two. We've been voting absentee and voting early and sending in our ballots via mail for a very long time in New Mexico, all with little to no fanfare. And I don't think that's going to change this election. I think where the rub comes is, should we be mailing out ballots just willy-nilly to people based on where we think they live, who we think they are, and should we have organizations going around and harvesting these ballots when we saw what happened in the past when former organizations were doing that in New Mexico specifically, and throwing away certain party registrations, not turning ballots in. So I think that the way the system exists today, I think there's plenty of integrity in the system the way it exists today. I think when you try to change that system, that's when folks get a little nervous.
Fair enough. Kathy, I got another question about social media and Facebook and others. You know, there's a lot of pressure at Facebook to do more to combat misinformation and stuff like that. In your view, how important is that this cycle? I mean, do they need to do more? Is this something that just can't do anything about because it just, we got Russians and everybody else, in our business doing this, trying to mess us up here? How important is social media to all this?
I think social media is very important. We definitely spend a lot of time on social media, and all of us love to. We love Facebook, and we also hate it for the decisions that they make about when we're going to censor, when we're going to try to make sure that there's not disinformation, and then maybe going too far and saying, well, now you can't have any ads or do anything within a week of the election. And I know that there's some stipulations about when they will allow ads to continue. But Facebook, social media is very important for how a lot of people get their information. What I do know is that it's not necessarily, I think, going to change the way people vote. Maybe perhaps would encourage them not to go vote, is what some of the literature has said. But I think that that we're going to be using social media for all kinds of things to get information. What we hope is that community-based organizations like the one that I represent will get out there and do a really good job of educating. We use social media to do that, about how to vote, getting people to vote, and trusting the electoral process, and just increasing that voter registration, and hopefully getting more than 30% of the people in New Mexico who are registered to vote to actually go out and do it.
You just anticipated my next question to Senator Feldman. We could have a record turnout here, again, taking outside mail-in voting and stuff like that. It's not going to be a ton of foot traffic, but I can imagine scenarios where people are out there at 7:10, 7:15, 7:20, and as you mentioned, by law, you still have to be allowed to vote. But I'm talking about what happens before then, about confidence in voting. Is there any danger in your mind about the confidence people have about voting, the integrity of voting? Is there some doubt that folks might have this cycle?
I think that actually those doubts have been fostered on social media in the past by foreign elements, with the idea of depressing the turnout. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very important what Facebook does. I'm disappointed with the half-hearted measure that they took to include only new ads and only a week before the election. That said, I think it's very important that Facebook is continuing that ban after the election and has said that they will not spread rumors of one candidate declaring him or herself the winner. What happens after the election here is just as important as what happens before the election. We don't have an election day, we have a season.
Right.
That's an excellent point. That's a point to finish on. Sorry, Kathy, we're out of time right there. Hey, thanks to our panelists for getting up to their elbows in politics as we enter the final stretches of this campaign season. Wasn't this a week for weather? Wednesday morning, a whole lot of us woke up to a dusting of snow on the ground and a bitter wind for good measure. By the end of the week, it was like it never happened. Don't you love New Mexico? If anything, we can appreciate those crazy 48 hours for beating down the Medio fire outside Santa Fe. But there's no such luck yet for our friends in California and the other areas experiencing wildfires right now, and the smoke and haze that's found its way to our air testifies. All of this is a reminder of an issue that's critical for younger voters, especially, and that's climate change. Can you blame them? This is the world as they see it and experience it. And summers like this only add to their sense of urgency. Thanks again for joining us and for staying informed and engaged. We'll see you again next week in Focus.
Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the McCune Charitable Foundation. Funding for the Your New Mexico Government Project comes from the Thornburg Foundation and New Mexico Local News Fund. And the Nieper Natural History Programming Fund for KNME TV. And viewers like you.